Hi, this is Bart Welling. The title of my presentation is The Emergency Humanities, an Invitation. You may remember my name from last summer. I helped organize the ASLE Nearly Carbon Neutral Symposium, Humanities on the Brink, Energy, Environment, Emergency, with Jordan Kinder and Jacob Gessling, and I'll be talking about some of those same ideas today. I'm happy to be joined on this panel by some of our very talented University of North Florida graduate students. And I just wanted to acknowledge that the University of North Florida is located in the ancestral homeland of the Mocama people. I'd like to start with what may seem like a rather strange question. What has your lowest point been during the pandemic so far? For me, this point came in September of last year when I was recovering from a bicycle accident and surgery that left me in the worst pain I had ever experienced. I was unable to sleep normally. I was unable to use my barely mobile, swollen, purple and yellow bruised right arm and numb hand for much of anything. I'm right-handed. The ordinary malaise associated with living in the pandemic-era disunited states of Trumplandia, a sense of crashing along uncontrollably on a stormy ocean of grief and terror and rage, trying simultaneously not to fall overboard and to keep my ears covered as the wild-eyed captain of the rudderless vessel and his supporters furiously denied that the storm was real. This malaise was compounded, after the accident, by an even worse sense of isolation and alienation, as I lay in bed at 2 and 3 in the morning, sick to death of Facebook and Netflix, floating in an OxyContin haze, reflecting on the pathetic fragility of my skeleton, my utter powerlessness to save anyone's life or change anyone's mind about COVID. Sitting on the beach or taking a slow, careful walk in the woods in the daytime didn't help much. Not only did I run the risk of encountering someone wearing a Trump 2020 mask, which for me was the emotional equivalent of getting punched in the head by a playground bully in the second grade, but the rushing waves and rustling leaves no longer spoke to me of freedom, as they had always done before. The whole world felt like a prison cell. The accident itself had happened too quickly to leave much psychological trauma in its wake, but the sense of abandonment I had experienced after breaking my shoulder lingered. I couldn't get over the memory of sitting, bleeding and shivering with pain, on someone's lawn at the entrance to my neighborhood, filthy, soaked from the rain and from the slippery wooden bridge that had brought me down, waiting for my wife to come from across town to take me to the hospital, and periodically lifting my head to see cars whipping by a few feet in front of me as if I weren't there. Not one person, not even one of the handful of fellow cyclists who passed me on the sidewalk, slowed down to ask if I needed help. My wife was on her way, but they didn't know that. Would it have been too much to ask for a kind word, maybe a bottle of water? I was pretty thirsty. We had lived in this neighborhood for over 17 years, and even if none of the dozens of drivers and passengers recognized me, which is highly unlikely, this is the South. Our neighborhood is full of people who loudly claim to believe in the divinity of the author of the parable of the Good Samaritan. Like rust or acid rain, memories of this experience ate away at whatever fragments of belief I still had in Americans' collective capacity to do something better than race, stumble, or sleepwalk into the abyss. It didn't help, of course, that the accident happened 2 months before Election Day, and as I lay awake in the middle of the night, I was doing a lot of doom scrolling, reading countless articles about the threat of an imminent election fiasco, or even a civil war sparked by white supremacists. On further reflection, I realized that the drivers and passengers, like almost all of us in our petroculture, had been assiduously trained by their parents, teachers, and even the infrastructure that conditions much of what we think of as possible, to consider themselves helpless regarding many basic matters of survival, from growing food to starting a fire to, in this case, helping an injured person. Indeed, they were being good Petro citizens by not blocking traffic on the 2-lane road to stop and talk to me. This realization made me less angry at them, but it only made my feelings of individual and collective powerlessness worse. You may be wondering why I'm dwelling on such unpleasant memories now, at a time when so many of us are justifiably celebrating a return to face-to-face gatherings, non-Zoom classes, an unexpectedly progressive new administration in the White House, a potential economic boom, and more. Perhaps you think I'm being self-indulgent, over-dramatizing a situation that pales in comparison to the suffering endured by so many COVID victims and their families. In a way, I'm trying to keep faith with an idea voiced by Dawn Turner in a powerful video editorial broadcast last June. In the editorial, Turner invoked her white viewers' anxiety over empty store shelves and the fear of contagion as a way of encouraging white Americans to do the work of understanding what everyday life was like for poor black Americans long before the pandemic hit, and thus empathize with the millions of protesters who are currently filling the streets in outrage over the latest in a centuries-long string of murders of unarmed black people by those charged with upholding the law. I want you to remember, Turner says about common pandemic experiences such as losing a job or being afraid to go outside, experiences that gave whites an opening to empathize with poor black people. Her editorial culminated in this plea.
If you take away nothing else from this pandemic, I want you to remember how powerless and hopeless and disaffected this moment has rendered you. I want you to realize that for poor black people, this is not a moment. If this pandemic offers even a smidgen of empathy, then maybe you understand why people might rise up and rage.
Having been a teacher of anti-racist literature and environmental justice texts for many years, I had developed more than a smidgen of empathy for poor people and people of color in the U.S. before my accident. But this empathy was deepened by my personal experience of simultaneously hypervisible and invisible suffering as a river of people and cars blithely streamed past, followed by weeks of unhappiness behind the walls of my house. Along with giving me a tiny taste of the misery of COVID and the rage of being ignored and oppressed for a lifetime, the accident drove home for me the extraordinary injustice embodied in business-as-usual operations of petroculture. While it makes vast numbers of human lives possible, petroculture also naturalizes the immiseration of countless people in hydrocarbon-powered cities and fossil fuel sacrifice zones, not to mention all the animals struck by vehicles and raised in the squalor of factory farms every year, in the name of a dream of ever-expanding comfort and prosperity that, aside from the fact that it is out of reach for billions of humans worldwide, is relegating future generations of human and non-human earthlings to the status of roadkill. I experienced more painfully than ever before the politics of alienation that George Monbiot rightly associates with cars, a politics that replacing internal combustion engines with electric motors by itself will do nothing to fix. Now, and over the crucial next few years, as we resist petroculture's feverish efforts to make the return to face-to-face existence a return to normal, people of all backgrounds need to remember Dawn Turner's exhortation to remember. The memory of suffering can serve as powerful Thoreauvian counterfriction to the politics of forgetting that claimed the lives of so many good people during the pandemic and is currently degrading democracy. In his 2015 encyclical letter Laudato Si, Pope Francis said that our goal in thinking about the suffering of the earth and of marginalized people should not be simply, quote, to amass information or to satisfy curiosity, but rather to become painfully aware, to dare to turn what is happening to the world into our own personal suffering, and thus to discover what each of us can do about it. Thanks to social distancing, the obvious problem with COVID is that this kind of painful awareness, instead of driving effective action, other than staying away from people, can easily spiral into ever-worsening waves of lonely misery. While I've been very grateful not to lose my paycheck, the Zoom teaching experience contributed to my depression, both because a significant number of students chose not to participate in classes and because some background noise things that have bothered me for many years about the humanities rose to the level of loud sirens. What good is it to know how to use a semicolon properly if the world is falling apart? Who cares, or should be expected to care, about the difference between iambic tetrameter and trochaic pentameter when they don't have a safe place to live or a steady supply of food? Those of us with tenure may enjoy an enviable degree of freedom to express controversial opinions, but what is that freedom worth if hardly anyone is interested in hearing what we have to say? I've been thinking for almost 3 years about the emergency humanities, about how the liberal arts can be repurposed in and for an age of emergencies. But all my reading and thinking didn't do much good when the COVID emergency hit the world and I faced my personal emergency. This was because, unlike the collectives profiled by Elaine Scarry in Thinking in an Emergency, Canadian mutual aid networks, Japanese neighborhood associations, organizations dedicated to spreading CPR skills everywhere, the emergency humanities so far exist mostly in the privacy of my own brain. Despite telling classes for years that we were overdue for a pandemic, I hadn't been preparing myself and building alliances under the tutelage of more experienced emergency humanists so that I would be able to make positive contributions to society when the inevitable pandemic developed. That's why I've put together this presentation. If you felt as powerless and hopeless and disaffected as I did last fall, in Dawn Turner's words, If you've been questioning the value of the business-as-usual humanities as much as I have, then I hope you'll consider joining me in the effort to bring the emergency humanities to life so we can transform individual powerlessness into collective power, preparing for it and responding to future emergencies more efficaciously than we have prepared for it and responded to the emergencies of the last year and a half. In the rest of this presentation, I will briefly cover some of the key aspects of the emergency humanities as I envision them. But first, I would like to give you a reading assignment, exposing you to the emergency humanities as they are already being done. Please pause my video and read this very short essay in the New York Times by Oxford professor Emma Smith. It's great, right? Here are some of the key takeaways for me with respect both to how Smith does the emergency humanities, although she doesn't use this term, and to the emergency humanities content, although I hate that word, of her article. Let's start with the obvious but vital point that Smith published this piece not on a little red blog or in an obscure journal of Shakespeare studies, but in the New York Times, a newspaper with hundreds of thousands of print subscribers and several million worldwide digital subscribers, including some of the most influential people on the planet. Rather like the CPR manuals that Elaine Scarry holds up as models of emergency rhetoric, Smith's essay is written with wonderful clarity, ensuring that it had a good chance of competing for readers' limited attention with the Times' cornucopia of other articles. This is not to say that Dr. Smith dumbed her ideas down for a mass audience. Rather, she was able to craft a voice calculated to welcome, not alienate, ordinary readers in order to do some advanced thinking in public about literature's role as a, quote, narrative vaccine against the dehumanizing effects of epidemics and pandemics. Furthermore, she squeezed many years of scholarly expertise into an almost impossibly small space, keeping the focus squarely on what we can learn from Shakespeare's relationship with the plague, rather than on her own cleverness. Because Professor Smith published her essay in the Times, it didn't languish for months or years, waiting to go through the usual absurdly long academic peer review process. The speed with which the essay appeared was important because, by publishing it in the early weeks before exploding infection and death toll numbers had begun to, quote, numb the mind, to paraphrase J.M. Kitseya's character Elizabeth Costello, Dr. Smith had the opportunity to frame the pandemic for policymakers and ordinary readers alike as something more than a numbers game, a policy problem, an issue for healthcare workers and researchers to deal with, while the rest of us passively waited to be rescued. In Dr. Smith's hands, the pandemic became a literary problem, a problem of empathy, a human problem. Her essay itself constituted a kind of vaccine against alienation and despair, because it reminded its readers of one thing virtually everyone can do, if nothing else, during a pandemic. This is to use the powers of language and the arts to resist the dignity and individuality-wrecking aspects of both the virus and inhumane responses to it. Not necessarily to defy death, as Dr. Smith writes, but to, quote, re-endow it with meaning and specificity. This task is something most coronavirus researchers and public health officials are too busy defying death to concern themselves with, but, of course, it has always been one of the central concerns of human culture, and I believe it should have always been at the top of the agenda for scholars in the humanities. Too many of us, I fear, have lost sight of first and last things, as Father Paneloux and Albert Camus' The Plague calls them, spending our careers wandering in dusty labyrinths of theory and impenetrable prose, carving endless Baroque filigrees in the ivory of the tower, instead of asking about the good we could try to accomplish outside the tower, and thus probably doing more to reinforce cultures of dehumanization than to challenge them, no matter how vociferously we may try to brand ourselves radicals and subversives. Given our common, if unequally distributed vulnerability to death, Dr. Smith's essay reminds us that the first and last things of religious thinkers are also the first and last things of humanists. And this isn't just about responding to deaths that are already occurring. Dr. Smith's terms, narrative vaccine and cultural prophylactic, hint at the possibility that understanding the value of human life as Shakespeare did may actually help emergency humanists be prepared to save lives. Did her article itself save lives? I have no evidence that it did, but its timely appearance meant that it had a chance of encouraging politicians, doctors, nurses, and everyday citizens to think and keep thinking of others as, quote, wonderfully, weirdly, cussedly, irredeemably individual beings rather than mere numbers. Admittedly, in view of humanism's long history of animating and providing cover for settler colonialism, ecocidal speciesism, and so on, I use terms such as emergency humanists with some trepidation. It is all too easy to imagine versions of the emergency humanities dedicated not to saving life, but to keeping petroculture on life support, propping up authoritarian regimes that exploit emergency discourses and fabricate emergencies in order to oppress and kill proponents of democracy, or serving the social reproduction needs of the ultra-wealthy in their 5-star New Zealand bug-out estates while the rest of the world floods and burns. Then, too, the very idea of the emergency humanities may seem a bit Monty Python-esque. Sometimes when I think about this term, I imagine a movie scene in which a bunch of academics stand outside a burning building, and instead of figuring out how to rescue people, we gesticulate madly as we debate the fireness of the fire, or squabble about whether we should call our field fire studies or pyrocriticism, or whether one needs a PhD to handle a fire hose or an MFA would suffice. People would scream, "Help me!" and we would answer, "But how can we be sure in the context of heteropatriarchal multinational carnophalagocentrism that your cry for help constitutes an authentic request for assistance rather than an interpolated wish fulfillment of the post-Bretton Woods bourgeois imaginary? By the way, what's a ladder?" I'm kidding, mostly. Dr. Smith's essay suggests that the humanities can partner with the arts they study to do work with profound practical as well as moral significance. Yes, on seeing Shakespeare and pandemics in the same title, some readers may have had a vision of literature professors knocking over medical equipment and generally making nuisances of themselves to doctors and nurses as they futilely declaimed one of Hamlet's soliloquies to unconscious COVID patients lying in hospital beds. But the novelty of seeing a humanities-based perspective on the pandemic in a periodical devoted in large part to coronavirus science and policy may itself have worked in Smith's favor. By the end of the essay, at least a few readers' views of what the humanities are good for may well have been transformed. I have often thought that one of the best things we can do to respond to the crisis in the humanities is to show how relevant the humanities can be in dealing with crises that people outside the humanities actually care about, and this is exactly what Dr. Smith does in the opinion piece. The last thing I want to mention about Dr. Smith is that, although she unapologetically embraces the didactic potential of literature, its potential helpfulness in an emergency, she does not reduce King Lear to plague-fighting propaganda. What is most useful about Shakespeare's oblique handling of the plague, she argues, is precisely what is most artful. His refusal to have characters die of plague, his insistence on treating every major death as a tragedy, rather than a bloodless data point or an inconvenience to the living. The emergency humanities do not have to be based on reductive interpretive procedures in which the critic tries to extract crude survival lessons from complex, contradictory works of art. Nor do emergency humanists have to restrict their analyses to literary texts and other works of art, such as dystopian and post-apocalyptic movies, that directly confront 21st century emergencies. The cultural archives of societies around the world, dating back far beyond Shakespeare, constitute an immense trove of wisdom regarding how humans have dealt with past emergencies, starting with the universal emergency known as death, but also including emergencies that we tend to think of as uniquely modern problems, such as rapid climate change and mis- and disinformation. In many cases, our ancestors crafted narratives and artifacts with the express purpose of helping future generations prepare for, or better yet, avoid emergencies they had narrowly survived in the past. Think, for instance, of the medieval Japanese stone tablets mentioned by Amitav Ghosh in The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable. These tablets were placed near the shore to warn the stone carvers' descendants not to build houses in areas vulnerable to tsunamis. As keepers and interpreters of our culture's memories both of how people in the past have forgotten the legacy of suffering and mortality that joins us all, and here I have an image from a medieval French manuscript of Jewish citizens being burned alive during the plague in the 1340s. As keepers and interpreters of our culture's memories both of how people in the past have forgotten the legacy of suffering and mortality that joins us all, and, more often, of how a painful awareness of shared humanity has driven pro-social action, as we can see in this image from after 9/11 at Ground Zero, a doctor treating emergency responders at the site of the World Trade Center collapse. We have a great deal to share with our cultures about the best and worst ways of preparing for, dealing with, recovering from, and representing emergencies. Now, you may be thinking that Dr. Smith's essay and Shakespeare's own fascination with tragic individualism and human exceptionalism may be overly anthropocentric and Eurocentric. There is some truth to this. Shakespeare's plays and works of art by his contemporaries have plenty to teach us, not just about the plague, but about deforestation, misogyny, speciesism, racism and slavery, anti-Semitism, air pollution caused by burning coal, reductive scientific ways of knowing that violently repressed ancient earth-friendly traditions. In short, about the rise of modern ways of living and thinking that are at the heart of our current dilemmas. However, if we want to learn about the best ways of rebuilding multi-species cultures of resilience, the best places to look for inspiration will be among indigenous African diaspora and other communities that have essentially been doing the emergency humanities already for hundreds of years, frequently under conditions of unimaginable terror and sorrow. Everyone can learn from these communities' efforts to re-endow the deaths not just of individual humans, but of individual animals, ecosystems, insect species, languages, and lifeways with, quote, meaning and specificity, in Emma Smith's words. Likewise, everyone must learn from their battles to keep their cultures and the earth alive. One of the core missions of the emergency humanities, as I envision them, is that of re-inhabiting our disciplines and the places we occupy as sites for the teaching and living of what Leanne Bedasamosake Simpson calls grounded normativity. This is a model of education grounded not in standardized tests, abstract theories, and other unacknowledged instruments of settler colonialism, but in the ground itself, with land as the primary teacher and curriculum, and with all human and non-human members of the community, not just people who can thrive within the exceedingly narrow parameters established by Western educational systems, all human and non-human community members being welcome to share their unique gifts. Simpson defines grounded normativity from an Anishinaabeg perspective in Anishinaabeg territory. While many thorny questions that unfortunately I don't have time to address here, remain unanswered regarding native land rights and the place of non-native people in the work of reestablishing grounded normativity, a transition to this learning model strikes me as absolutely necessary if humanity, the humanities, and non-human life are to flourish again. In his frustratingly apolitical or anti-political and sometimes maddeningly doom-resigned book, Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, Roy Scranton writes that, quote, we must build arcs, not just biological arcs to carry forward endangered genetic data, but also cultural arcs to carry forward endangered wisdom. One problem with the idea of biological arcs was vividly demonstrated in May 2017 when Norway's global seed vault on the island of Spitsbergen in the Svalbard archipelago was partially flooded due to unseasonably warm weather. And this was a facility that was supposed to, quote, last for eternity with minimal human input, preserving seeds representing hundreds of thousands of varieties of crops. On the cultural arcs side, Alfonso Cuarón's 2006 film Children of Men brilliantly exposes the blankly horrifying futility of preserving cultural masterpieces in an arc of arts, when ordinary people, who could destroy them, yes, but who are also the only ones capable of giving them meaning, are prevented from seeing them at all. The arcs I imagine people in the emergency humanities working together with students, community allies, and non-human partners to create are neither purely biological nor purely cultural, but biocultural from top to bottom. Unlike the arcs in the story of Noah, the archetypal arc, or the Petrotropian arcs in Roland Emmerich's over-the-top disaster film 2012, most of these arcs will be stationary. They will be re-inhabitory eco-social communities invested not just in preserving endangered beings and languages, but in breathing new life into tradition while adapting to the unpredictable conditions of the so-called Anthropocene. These arcs will not survive because of any impenetrable boundaries they interpose between those who seek refuge within them and the flatlining biosphere outside their walls. They will survive because, like the healthy eco-social systems maintained by indigenous people and their ancestors for countless thousands of years, they consist of dense relational networks predicated on reciprocity, respect, and care, including care for the monstrous beings and places that Bruno Latour urges us to love, learning from Victor Frankenstein's tragic failure to take care of his creature. Well, I think I'll end there for now, but thank you very much for your time and attention, and I really hope to hear from people who are interested in the idea of the emergency humanities. As the title indicates, this paper was intended as an invitation, and I hope we can gather at some point in the not too distant future, maybe around a nice campfire or on a trail somewhere, and work together to figure out what the emergency humanities are all about, what they might look like. And I encourage you to check out my grad students' papers in this panel, and I hope you all have a wonderful conference. Thank you very much.